Welcome to True Crime Threads, where real life's unravel and secrets refuse to stay buried. Today, a devoted wife uncovers a chilling truth hidden behind 7 years of marriage. Elena and David Whitmore had been married for 7 years, and in the quiet town of Fairview, Oregon, they were seen as the kind of couple others aspired to be. Their life together seemed like something out of a magazine. Quiet, loving, and steady. David was a successful architect who often spoke at local conferences and won small city contracts for designing eco-friendly community spaces. He was well-groomed, calm, and always polite. Elena, who taught part-time art classes at the community center, loved sharing glimpses of their life on social media. She posts photos of their anniversary dinners, road trips to the coast, and the garden David planted in their backyard during the first spring of their marriage. Friends admired them, neighbors waved warmly, and even casual acquaintances believed they had found something rare and enviable. David made sure their life ran smoothly. Bills were always paid on time. Birthdays were never forgotten. He even surprised Elena every few months with handwritten notes or small gestures, like baking her favorite lemon cake or leaving flowers on the kitchen counter. He really lost his temper and kept a cool head even during minor disagreements. Elena often told people how lucky she felt. They had no children by choice and instead focused on travel and growing together. They talked about buying a cabin someday or starting a design and art podcast as a hobby. There were no red flags, no moments of serious doubt. Elena had dated men before David who were loud, unpredictable, or overly ambitious. David was different, soft-spoken but firm, supportive without being overbearing. He listened when she talked. He helped with chores. He encouraged her to take up painting again after years of neglecting her brushes. When Elena's mother passed away, he handled the funeral arrangements quietly, never seeking credit or sympathy. To her, he was the kind of man who brought peace instead of chaos. In the town of Fairview, people often whispered about what a solid couple they were. At community barbecues, David flipped burgers while Elena helped set up the drink table. During winter drives, they volunteered at the shelter. There was a kind of rhythm to their life, a smooth, shared tempo. Elena kept journals filled with memories, small tokens, and future plans. She never imagined there would be a day she'd look at them differently. Their house was modest, but filled with warmth. The living room had paintings Elena made and shelves lined with David's architecture books. They had routine Sunday morning pancakes, Tuesday movie nights, evening walks through the neighborhood. Nothing about their life felt temporary. It all felt built to last. But sometimes, comfort can dull curiosity. Elena never had a reason to dig deeper, never thought to question anything. What would be the point? David's past before they met was vague, but not alarmingly so. He said he had moved around a bit in his 20s, figuring out his career. He didn't talk much about his family, only saying they weren't close. It never seemed strange, just part of who he was. For 7 years, Elena believed she had everything: love, security, trust. In reality, she was living inside a carefully crafted illusion only built not just with charm and routines, but with silence, misdirection, and something far darker than she ever could have imagined. The moment that shifted everything came on an ordinary Thursday night. Elena was scrolling through her phone while waiting for dinner to finish in the oven. David was away at a weekend conference, something he often did once or twice a year. She used his rare quiet evenings to catch up on reading, call her sister, or binge crime documentaries. That night, she stumbled upon a headline that immediately caught her attention. It was about a woman who had resurfaced after being presumed dead for more than 8 years. The article was vague but intriguing. What truly frowned Elena was the photo used, a grainy shot showing the woman walking beside a man in the background. His face wasn't fully visible, but there was something disturbingly familiar about him. The posture, the height, even the way he carried himself, it looked almost exactly like David. At first, she laughed at herself. The idea was ridiculous. There were thousands of men with similar builds. It had to be a coincidence, but something gnawed at her. She found herself staring at the photo for a long time. Then zooming in on it, she recognized the hand on the woman's back. The long fingers, the faint scar across the knuckle. David had told her he got that scar while building a treehouse as a teenager. The hand in the image had the same mark. Her mind struggled to accept what her eyes were seeing. She kept returning to the article, rereading every line. The woman's name was Abigail Sloan, and she had gone missing from Seattle in 2016. She was declared legally dead after no leads turned up. But recently, someone had reported seeing her in Nevada. She had been found under a different name, living in a quiet desert town. According to the report, she refused to speak to the press and offered no explanation for her disappearance. The article mentioned nothing about the man in the photo. Elena searched Abigail Sloan's name, digging through old local reports and blogs covering her disappearance. She found images of Abigail from years ago. Abigail looked younger back then, but there was a distinct sadness in her eyes that still matched the recent photo. More importantly, she discovered that Abigail's boyfriend had been the last person to see her. His name wasn't listed, but one article quoted police, stating that the boyfriend was uncooperative and vanished soon after. That detail planted a deep seed of doubt in Elena's mind. From that moment on, she couldn't shake the unease. She started comparing more old photos, images of David from earlier years, the ones he had on his LinkedIn and a few framed ones in his office. The resemblance to the man in the article was undeniable. It wasn't just similar, it was exact. Questions began stacking up in her mind. Why did David never mention living in Seattle? Why were there no pictures of him before 2016? Why had he never introduced her to anyone from his past? She had never thought to push before. Now, she couldn't ignore the silence anymore. What she had dismissed as a chance resemblance was beginning to look like a hidden connection. And as her thoughts spiraled, one fear became louder than all the others. What if the man she married wasn't who he claimed to be at all? The more Elena tried to ignore the doubts, the louder they became. She began to notice small details she had previously brushed aside. How David always avoided conversations about his past. How he kept a separate locked drawer in his study. How he never left any physical trace of his life before meeting her. She tried to convince herself it was nothing, just a mind spiraling from one suspicious article. But every instinct in her body told her otherwise. Something wasn't right, and she needed to know the truth. David was scheduled to be gone for 2 more days. That gave her time. After pacing around the house and staring at the locked drawer for nearly an hour, Elena finally decided to open it. She had once seen him place the key behind a bookshelf in the study. Her hands trembled as she reached behind the dusty hardcovers, and to her shock, the small silver key was still there. It slid into the drawer's lock effortlessly. Inside, she didn't find blueprints or client folders like she expected. Instead, there was a manila envelope stuffed with documents. As she pulled it out, her breath caught. The first thing she saw was a passport not in the name of David Whitmore, but someone called Mark Lewis. Below it, there was another writ with a different name, then another, all with David's face, but different birth dates, cities, and identities. Each document was crafted with unsettling precision. They weren't souvenirs or props. They were real. There were also credit cards, a few under names she'd never heard before. More disturbing was a single folder labeled Seattle. It held a printed map of a neighborhood, old receipts, and a worn photograph. Elena's hands shook as she picked up the photo. It showed David the younger standing next to a woman, the same woman from the article, Abigail Sloan. They were close, smiling, his hand resting protectively on her shoulder. The photo had a date scribbled on the back, February 2016, just 2 months before Abigail went missing. For several minutes, Elena couldn't move. The evidence was overwhelming, and with it came a sharp realization. David had lied about everything. His name, his history, even the version of himself he presented every day. The perfect husband was a manufactured identity. After collecting herself, Elena returned everything carefully, snapping a photo of each document with her phone. Then she locked the drawer, slid the key back behind the bookshelf, and sat her down in the living room, staring at the walls she once called home. Every frame, every decoration now looked unfamiliar. She couldn't confront him. Not yet. She needed to know who he truly was. Over the next few hours, She started cross-referencing the names on the IDs, searching public databases and local records. Some led nowhere, but one alias Mark Lewis was connected to a mention in a police blog post tied to Abigail's disappearance. It was a small reference, easily missed, but it was there. That connection was all she needed. She knew she couldn't go to the police without solid backing, so instead, she reached out to a private investigator. She had to find out everything. What she had seen only scratched the surface. Something told her the worst was still waiting. The investigator Elena hired worked quickly and with discretion. Within a week, she received a file containing detailed background checks, address histories, and flagged alias Cecil, of which painted a much darker picture of the man she thought she knew. David Whitmore had never existed before 2016. That identity was entirely fabricated. The man she married was actually Daniel Marks, born in Colorado under a name now legally erased. He had cycled through at least 3 different identities over the past decade, each carefully constructed, each abandoned just as quietly when the walls began to close in. Daniel's past was a mosaic of short-term jobs, vanishing records, and failed relationships. In several states, he had lived under new names, blending in just long enough before disappearing again. The longest traceable period was the one linked to Abigail Sloan. He had lived in Seattle as Mark Lewis and worked as a freelance designer. According to police records, he was Abigail's boyfriend at the time of her disappearance. But after she vanished, Mark Lewis disappeared too. There were no charges, but he was listed as a person of interest who never responded to follow-up interviews. The story he had told Ellen that he moved around in his 20s figuring things out was technically true. What he left out was a reason. Every move was a calculated escape. He left no paper trails, no social ties, and no reason for people to follow. The deeper the investigator went, the clearer it became that David, Daniel, or Mark, whoever he really was, spent years running from something. Armed with this information, the authorities reopened Abigail Sloan's case. The digital trail Elena provided photos, the documents, and the investigators' findings was enough to build a new profile. David was placed under surveillance. Elena didn't tell him what she knew. She played the part of the unsuspecting wife, terrified each night that he might sense something was off. She couldn't risk alerting him. If he had vanished before, he could vanish again. After several days of surveillance, law enforcement moved in. David was arrested during his morning jog, a time when he was usually alone and unguarded. When they brought him in for questioning, he didn't try to run or deny who he was. Instead, he gave a calm and composed statement. According to him, he hadn't harmed Abigail. She had been trying to escape a dangerous stalker. Then he had helped her vanish by faking her disappearance. He claimed they staged it together, using cash and stolen documents, then parted ways. He insisted she wanted to disappear and had no regrets. The story was delivered with precision, like something rehearsed over years. It painted him not as a villain, but as a protector. Authorities were skeptical. His history didn't support such selflessness. But without Abigail to confirm or refute his story, they had little more than circumstantial evidence. The charges they filed fraud, identity theft, and obstruction kept him in custody. But the most serious allegations remained unproven. Elena, now pulled into a world she never imagined, watched the man she once loved sit behind bars and calmly explain a life she never knew existed. But the truth was still incomplete. One piece remained, missing Abigail. Only she knew the real story, and until she came forward, the full weight of what David or Daniel had done would remain in the shadows. It took nearly a month before Abigail Sloan agreed to speak. She had been found living under a new identity in a small Nevada town, where she worked at a local diner and rented a modest apartment. When law enforcement approached her, she was hesitant, afraid that speaking up would drag her back into the life she had worked so hard to escape. But after days of deliberation, she agreed to give a statement behind closed doors. Her version of the story shattered the narrative David had carefully constructed. According to Abigail, there was never a stalker. She hadn't been running from anyone except Daniel himself. In the beginning, Their relationship had been like any other. He was attentive, thoughtful, and charismatic, but over time, he became controlling. He isolated her from her family, slowly distanced her from friends, and watched her every move. His kindness had an expiration date, and once she was fully dependent on him, he turned cold and manipulative. When she tried to leave, he convinced her she was in danger, that someone else was after her, and only he could keep her safe. That was when he proposed the idea of vanishing. Abigail was emotionally exhausted, and Daniel exploited her fear. He helped her fake her disappearance, destroyed her identification, and relocate to another state. But once she was gone, he didn't protect her. Instead, he drained her savings, cut off contact, and left her completely alone. She had been living under the radar ever since, always scared he might find her again. Her testimony shifted the entire case. It wasn't just a matter of false identity anymore. It was coercion, psychological manipulation, and calculated deception. Investigators used her statement to revisit old evidence, and while they still couldn't tie him directly to a physical crime, it became clear that his actions had long-lasting consequences on more than one life. New charges were added: emotional abuse, financial exploitation, and aiding in the falsification of legal documents. For Elena, hearing Abigail's truth was both horrifying and utterly validating. The man she had shared a life with wasn't just hiding a past, had deliberately rewritten it. He had entered Elena's life not as a changed man, but as someone who had never stopped running from what he had done. The charming, thoughtful husband had never existed. He was just another version of Daniel, sculpted to appear perfect on the surface. David No, officially identified as Daniel Marks, remained in custody. His trial was scheduled for the following year, and although the charges didn't include murder, the scope of his deception was enough to keep him behind bars. His calm demeanor never broke. Even as more details emerged, he maintained that his intentions had never been harmful, but no one believed him anymore. Elena filed for annulment, erased every trace of their shared name, and moved out of the house they once called home. What remained of her life had to be rebuilt from the ground up. She had lived with a stranger for 7 years, trusted him, loved him, and unknowingly helped him hide from justice. In the end, the truth wasn't just shocking, it was paralyzing. Not because it was filled with violence, but because it had been hidden in plain sight. Lies buried beneath smiles, secrets hidden behind Sunday morning pancakes, and a man who had perfected the art of becoming whoever he needed to be.